Hello, and welcome to the 10th episode of Conversations in Philosophy, a close readings series for the London Review of Books. I'm Jonathan Ray, freelance philosopher and regular contributor to the LRB, and I'm sitting in the LRB offices in London, and I'm joined from the other side of the Atlantic by James Wood, critic, novelist, and staff writer of The New Yorker. Hello, James, and welcome.
Hello, Jonathan.
Our assignment for this episode is a very short book by Simone de Beauvoir that has long been a favourite of mine. Now, de Beauvoir is probably best known as a novelist and a pioneering feminist, but she was also a professor of philosophy, and that was within the rather strict academic French system. And this book is, by any standards, a work of a professor of philosophy in the strict sense of the word. It's called Pour une morale de l'ambiguïté, and it was published in Paris in 1947 when de Beauvoir was still in her 30s, and it was translated into English very quickly the following year by Bernard Frechtman under the title The Ethics of Ambiguity. So The Ethics of Ambiguity, well, I said it's an early work, but I'm inclined to see it as the launch pad for the extraordinary range of stories, memoirs and philosophical investigations that de Beauvoir was to produce over the following 40 years, and most especially for the massive monument of feminist philosophy, which is Le Deuxième Sexe, the second sex. But unlike the second sex, The Ethics of Ambiguity is extremely concise. It can't be much more than 20,000 words, but it's written in a plain, lucid and rather classical style, rather dry, you might say, but also quite compressed. The notes that I made of key points while rereading it last week are almost as long as the book itself. Anyway, it's a book that I continue to admire very deeply, and I'm hoping that James is going to agree with me. So, James, what did you make of it?
Jonathan, once again, I'm in the delicious position of reading a book that I'd not encountered before at your suggestion, and you have great taste. I thought this was an absolutely wonderful book. I was really impressed by its lucidity and humanism. I think it's better than Camus' much more famous The Myth to Sisyphus, with which it shares some concerns and emphases. And I think I was struck. Well, we'll get into the weeds of the philosophy shortly. But if I take, as it were, a slightly non- or meta-philosophical view of the book, I think I was struck by what a very eloquent plea it is, written not long after the Second World War, for the absolute paramount importance of freedom, of reciprocity between free selves, and the paramount importance of the individual. No man can save himself alone. To will oneself free is to will others free. And that's a refrain that builds in intensity throughout the book. And I was very struck by that. I'll just say before we get going further, there's a passage in the book, is it maybe the second chapter, where de Beauvoir talks about the child and says, you think back to being a child. You're thrown into a given world. You accept all the values you're given as somehow ready-made, as statuesque, as ironclad. And it's not until adolescence that you begin to ask, is this the way it should be? Is this the way it must be? What are these values that seemed objectively founded? Perhaps they're just something, my dad cooked up for me. And de Beauvoir says at that point, the adolescent enters morality. And then continues that by saying this drama of original choice is something for the existentialist which is ceaselessly asked and returned to throughout the rest of an ideal life. But of course, it's not how most people live. And I was struck again and again reading this book. So first of all, by its great lucidity and humanism. And second, by what, on any ordinary way of thinking, is an extraordinarily difficult and demanding and strenuous request from existentialism. This ceaseless questioning of oneself and one's own freedom. I think at another point she says it's easy to be the critic. Of course, I would be interested in this passage. She says it's easy to be the critic because the critic can sort of see that Cézanne comes after Titian and so on, but actually as we live with just the painter. Our projects are one painting after the other, and we're trying to sort of build on the painting before and do a new painting and so on. But again, so the lucidity, the humanism, and finally, actually the strenuousness of a perpetual struggle was what struck me about this book.
That's very interesting. And I too was very struck by the references to children, the children's experience in this book. And actually, when she writes about, perhaps we should say a bit about what she means by the ambiguity that's in the
Yes.
title. It's not ambiguity in the sense of a double meaning of words. It's a double meaning. It's the double meaning of existence. And the way she explained it actually reminded me of a childhood experience. I'm about 8 years old, and I'm in a room with my brother and sister, my father and mother, and 2 grandparents. And I'm looking at them all, and I'm thinking, well, I'm looking at them talking and eating and drinking and not really very self-conscious at all. I'm very conscious of them. But I also know that they could all look at me and then I would just be an object in their eyes. And I was very struck, the baby philosopher in me, by this discrepancy of perspective, that they were an object that I was observing and I was an object that they were observing, and that there was no way of bridging that gap. And that, I think, is basically what she means by the idea of ambiguity. The ambiguity of existence is this irresolvable tension between the fact that I am a consciousness or a living body in the world, and in a way the world is as it presents itself to me, to my eyes and ears and the rest of my body. But that also, I wouldn't even be aware of the world as a world unless I was aware that it was a world that was being observed by other people, and that one of the objects they observe in this world is me. And she says that there's been a tendency in philosophy, and I think she means in human experience in general, to slide away from this, it's as though this creates a huge pit, a chasm at the origin of our existence, and various kinds of philosophers and moralists and theologians desperately try to fill in this pit. They're never going to succeed, and de Beauvoir is saying you shouldn't even try. You need to meditate on the fact that actually nothing is really given to you absolutely, that you have to invent, you make everything up as you go along. That life is, she does refer a bit to Kierkegaard, and Kierkegaard's idea that existence is a paradox, or that existence is incommensurable. There's something, and Kierkegaard, very like her, is saying you should suppress the temptation to slide away from this ambiguity, this paradox. You need to embrace it. And she does... She acknowledges that sometimes what she's saying may sound a bit individualistic, and she says, yes, indeed, it is individualistic, because we need to accept that each one of us leads our individual life as individuals. But we also need to recognize that none of us would be able to exist as we do as individuals unless we were surrounded by other people. She says somewhere, human beings are like the stones in an arch that support each other. And then she says, sort of rather self-contradictorily, but of course the arch itself isn't resting on anything. So I don't know quite how the physics of this is supposed to work, but in a way the physics of it isn't supposed to work. The physics of human existence is not subject to the laws of physics. I did want to mention a translation point. We're in the hands of an old translator who isn't too great, and there's a very obvious trap in translating de Beauvoir. She says, il faut assumer notre fondamentale ambiguïté. He translates assumer as assume. So it says we must assume our fundamental ambiguity. But assume here, it's rather more like in English you talk about the princess assumes the throne. It's to take something up. It's to own it. We need to own the ambiguity, the absurdity, the gap, which is at the heart of our existence, and we mustn't look away from it. We mustn't divert ourselves from it, even though it would be much more comfortable for us if we did.
Yes, that the arch that hangs together but doesn't rest on anything, or the assumption, in the sense of ownership, the absorption into oneself, the embodying of this ambiguity is part of what I meant by the challenge, the difficulty of what we're being asked to do. Or rather, I guess it's the sort of thing that sounds easy enough when you're reading it as philosophy and quite hard to do every day, if that makes sense. So it's one thing when you're reading Sartre or de Beauvoir, or to some extent Camus, where they overlap, and they talk about perpetual struggles and so on. In the case of Beauvoir, she talks about, she says, when we look at a landscape, when we look at a beautiful sunset or the sea or something, we might love it so much that we want to become it, but we can't become it, and we're separated from it. And part of our understanding of how we are in relation to it is this separation. And she goes on to say, in effect, so we're separated in that way from the object, from the world, but we're also separated from ourselves in that way. There's some lack that's inscribed within us. I think she quotes Sartre along the following lines: "Man is a being who makes himself a lack of being in order that there might be being." So this, and then she goes on to say, rather strikingly, this failure is the condition of being alive, and without failure there's no ethics. Without this sort of failure, we can't even begin to think of freedom. Indeed, freedom comes from this sort of tension between, or this tension in our incoherence from ourselves. And what I mean about the difficulty is that this sort of thing, and I think we were talking about this last time when we were talking about Sartre, in some ways, some of these ways of thinking they get flattened down in the next 50 or 60 years as sort of, I'm talking from the literary theory point of view, as moves in literary theory, right? If we think of the text as being, incoherent to itself, divided against itself, and so these in some way become moves in theory. And there's a way in which you can read Beauvoir very comfortably and just say, yes, I know what the moves are, right? We're incoherent to ourselves. We must live in the consciousness of the antinomies. This is the metaphysical ambiguity about which she speaks. Subject and object cannot be fused. They're separated. There can be a joy from this sense of failure. We turn the lack into a positivity, whatever. You can read these in the comfort of your armchair, particularly within an academic context, as sort of pioneering moments in 1947 as what will become a series of moves in philosophy and certainly in theory, postmodern theory. And yet, what I mean by the difficulty is that if we go back to 1947, she's writing this in the ruins of the Second World War, if not quite of Paris, but in the ruins of the Second World War. And if we're really to take her seriously, as we must, these can't just be moves. We must keep on thinking about what she and, say, Camus mean by this sort of perpetual struggle, the Sisyphean rolling up and rolling down of the rock. I think she says man makes himself a lack, but he can deny the lack as lack and affirm himself as positive. He then assumes, embodies, takes up within himself the failure. We rejoin ourselves only by agreeing to remain at a distance from ourselves. Again, you can just easily say, I know what to do with that. But as an actual project in life, that's difficult, because you'd have to get up each morning and are enjoined by her to get up each morning and say, okay, how do I live in these antinomies, in this ambiguity? And that seems not at all easy. And it's no surprise that she says a lot of people just can't really bear the anguish of this perpetual choice, the choice that the adolescent thinks of making and then often puts aside and, goes into banking, as it were. It's hard, right?
It's hard. And yes, I think maybe we should dwell a bit on the idea of liberté, of freedom, because it's a very key term in the text. And she doesn't perhaps explain well enough that she doesn't mean it as a kind of condition that we might aspire to, that ideally we would have some free. No, it's a condition that we're condemned to.
Thanks for listening to this extract from Close Readings. You can listen to the full episode and all our other Close Readings series by signing up to our Close Readings subscription. If you're listening in Apple, you can do that just by going to the top of this podcast, or for Spotify and other podcast apps, go to lrb.me/audio, or click on the link in the description.